my guest this week is Dr. Zack Whites who runs the Napoleonic channel on YouTube. And of course, this week, and then leading up to the premiere of the Napoleon movie, we're going to discuss the life of Napoleon. And of course, we have to discuss the elephant in the room, which is a movie that's coming out, which is why we are doing this. So, what is your expectations? Let's begin straight away to the movie. We spoke a little bit about this on Twitter, but give us your view of what you know what Ridley Scott is like when it comes to historical epics, but still, what is your expectations?
Well, we also now that according to Ridley Scott, people like me are basically wasting our lives because you don't need to bother with history because none of us were there, so we can all just make it up as we go along. If folks aren't familiar, the context to that sass is Ridley Scott did an interview with Dan Snow on History Hit. You can catch it on YouTube, in which he basically said that of the 400 books that have been written about Napoleon, only the first two have anything that's worth reading, which shows a catastrophic lack of understanding of what historians actually do, but we'll park that. And then when Dan flagged up the Austerlitz scene, which we'll probably end up talking about in the second installment, he asked Ridley, what do you say to historians who turn around and say, yeah, but that's not how it happened, because there's a whole mythologizing around the smashing of the lakes, which, as I say, we'll talk about another time. And Ridley turned around and said, well, just turn to them and say, were you there? No. Right, well, fine. Which seems like a bit of a dumb comment on two scores, because firstly, well, neither were you, Ridley, so why are you any better placed by that logic? But equally, the whole point of what historians do is we go and find the accounts of the people who were there, which is the next best thing to talking to the people who were there, given that they've been dead for about 200 years. So it is quite difficult to communicate with them directly. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of my expectation for the film, I started out with high hopes. I have been banging the drum the whole way on that kind of line of it's going to be historically inaccurate. That's a given because it's a film. It's not there to be accurate. It's there to entertain. And I think it will be entertaining. My hope is that it will fire people up about the period and make them tune into shows like this. You know, pick up a book, listen to a podcast, watch a YouTube video, whatever it is that you do, just go beyond the film. And for heaven's sake, don't take to the social media platforms and start pretending that because you've watched Ridley Scott's Napoleon, you suddenly are the voice of all knowledge when it comes to the Napoleonic Wars.
And to bring up the point, for anyone who read history or we spoke about this again, who knows history, if you know that the first accounts are definitely not the best, the analogy of Roman historians, for example, let's take Tacitus or Cassius Dio or any one of those, they are obviously going to be biased. So the more or less, and I think in more or less recent times that historians have become less and less biased and trying to. More recent books are actually better, and again, to do another comparison, ancient Egypt, for example, if you read early books, there's so much new material that we know about the history of Egypt that wasn't available in the first few books that are missing. So the further away you get, actually better the books will be, and to say make a comment that the first books are the best ones to read, but no, that's not the case at all.
No, absolutely. There is a certain inverted commas art. So some academics love to kind of emphasize the fact that, oh, history has a muse. Fine, whatever. But the point is there's a skill base to being a historian. That's why it takes years of study at university to acquire those skills.
And so he probably thinks that Gibbon is the ultimate guide to the fall of Rome. But that's just the real Napoleon now. I mean,
the one thing that I would just add in is, turning around and saying, oh, it's only worth reading the two books is a little bit like turning around and saying, well, I've seen one film about the Romans, so I don't need to go and watch Gladiator now. It just doesn't compute. It's just completely wrong.
Yeah. So, of course, Napoleon is the one we're going to discuss here. And I want to begin with a little bit history of Corsica first, because Napoleon, as we discussed, will be obsessed with the history of Corsica, because Corsica was, I don't know, not quite sure how the situation was, because I'm not quite sure if they were independent or part of Italy, but they were not part of France until right before Napoleon's time, and they were ruled by Paoli, but which has again become a Napoleonic obsession. So let's talk a little bit about Corsica, where he would be born and raised, and of course until the French takeover of Corsica.
Yeah, so Corsica, for folks who aren't familiar with the geography, island in the Mediterranean, kind of, if you were to draw a line sort of diagonally southeast from France, it'll eventually kind of go through Corsica if you find the right point, north of Sardinia. So that's the neck of the woods that we're talking about. It's actually owned by Genoa, so it's a Genoese island, but there's this sort of long history of resistance. It's quite a sort of semi-independent, fiercely kind of nationalistic is probably a difficult word to use at this time, because nationalism still kind of the idea of nationalism is still kind of developing, but you get what I'm kind of getting at here. They have that sense of self. As you say, you talked about one of the big guys within the Corsican independence, Paoli, there becomes a leading light. Napoleon's dad is initially quite close to Paoli. Napoleon idolizes Paoli for much of his life. But there's a change. I mean, we're talking about a Genoese colony. So how does Napoleon kind of become French? Well, basically, the French buy it. Well, they buy it off the Genoese the year before Napoleon's born, and then they have to conquer the place, because the Corsicans kind of turn around and go, well, this is our opportunity. You know, now we're not under the cosh from the Genoese, so now is the opportunity to assert this independence movement, whilst you've got that instability and uncertainty of the handover of power. The French conquer the place, and Napoleon's dad then makes a difficult choice. He can continue to side with this sort of outcast independence movement that's effectively shot its bolt and failed, or he can ingratiate himself with the French hierarchy. And we're talking, when it comes to Carlo Bonaparte, he's a minor Italian nobleman. So he's in that level of society where he knows people and he can be quite useful to the new French regime. And so he capitalizes on that. And as a result of that, he is then able to benefit from a decree that enables the sons of minor, and it's important to emphasize minor aristocracy, to then be sent to France for education. And eventually Napoleon ends up at the École Royale Militaire at the age of just 9, where ironically he's told that he might make quite a good sailor. So that would have been very different had Napoleon kind of opted for that line. But yeah, the Corsican independence movement rumbles on for quite a long time, and Napoleon is absolutely obsessed with this. It's part of the reason that he's so unpopular when he goes to school, because he's reading all about Corsican independence, he's writing about Corsican independence, he's handing these kind of documents to his teachers going, what do you think? And everyone's kind of going, why are you so obsessed with Corsican independence? It's French. France owns it. You're here on the say-so of the king, on the king's dime. What are you doing? So it does lead to him being kind of ostracized. And the phrase that tends to be used about Napoleon is that he's conceived Italian, born Corsican, and was French effectively when it suited. Because it's not until the rejection from Paoli, where the Bonaparte family literally has to cut and run, they're literally fleeing over the mountains, have to bundle themselves into a ship and sail back to the French mainland, that then Napoleon properly throws his lot in with France and becomes kind of French. But he retains that Corsican ancestry for a lot of his life. For much of his career, he's signing a Buonaparte, a much more Italian spelling. And he has that thick Corsican accent the whole way through his life. In fact, during the Italian campaigns, he's able to converse with the locals in the local dialect, and he's able to pass himself off as Italian in order to kind of surreptitiously get intel from a couple of Austrian officers on one occasion. So he's very much kind of dyed-in-the-wool Corsican up until the moment when it's clear that he's not going to get anywhere by pursuing this kind of Corsican line.
And I want to begin with his upbringing, and also know Dan Snow as well made this comment that it came from in the advertising. They said it came from nothing and it conquered everything. But and then as you spoke about, Dan Snow still made a joke that he was privileged. But and yes, he was in a way because they were nobles, as we discussed his family. But again, they were poor. They weren't rich, so they weren't really that much more privileged. The only thing that as he was able to, as we talked about, to become a have a military career was because he was noble, and that's really the only privilege that he had. Other than that, they didn't have much money to go on, and they were living in poverty pretty much until he became the emperor. So he wasn't that much privileged that some people make it out to be. He was really more normal, to put it that way. The only real privilege they had was the title nobility. That didn't mean that you were rich by any chance.
I mean, all things are relative in this, right? So he doesn't compare to some of his marshals who literally crawl out of the inverted commas peasant class. So if you were a peasant, or actually even if you were part of the sort of business class or the clerical class within French society, you would look at Napoleon and still kind of acknowledge him as somebody who had a relatively privileged upbringing. You know, this guy gets his education for free, and that education sets him up. The whole reason behind this is to set these people up so that they become good members of good standing of French society who the French king can rely on. You know, it's trying to foster that loyalty. So he has that leg up. Sure, it's not, you know, it's important is to emphasize it's minor nobility, it's minor aristocracy. It is not as though, you know, he's living in some palace on the island of Corsica. You can go and see the building where he's born, and it's a very nondescript building. It's just very plain, and it's part of a series of flats now. It's not much to look at all. You know, the family is relatively poor because the nature of Corsica is that it's not a lavishly rich island. His mother seems to have been quite a formidable woman by many stretches. We could do a whole podcast on her, quite frankly. She's quite kind of a severe matriarch. Gave them a kind of a decent upbringing. Certainly, the family did as best they could, but equally, you know, he's not dining off of gold platters every night and sort of eating venison and all the rest of it. I think, I mean, with 8 words, Ridley Scott, you know, he came from nothing, he conquered everything. Ridley Scott immediately kind of taps straight into the vein of that dominant Napoleonic myth, a kind of rags to riches, very seductive myth that has some truth to it, but equally you can overplay it in both directions. You know, you can pretend that he was destitute and a peasant, or you can pretend that actually he was from that ultimate upper echelon of society, and that wasn't the case. You know, this is another reason why he was unpopular in military academy, because, well, you're son of Corsican nobility, please, you know, my father is the Comte de insert long French name here, you know, Beauchamp, Bouhard, whatever. My French is appalling, as you probably worked out. And so in the pecking order, he's nothing, and he knows that. And ironically, it's the revolution that gives him the opportunity, because otherwise he would have been destined for a career of mediocrity. His position wasn't going to give him rapid promotion up through the ranks in the French army as it was pre-1789. But equally, he's got a hell of a lot more of a head start than somebody who's enlisting as a trooper in the French cavalry during this time.
And we don't have much time to go into him, but as you know, Bernadotte would later become a key figure in defeating Napoleon. Just to mention him for a brief second, he was a peasant soldier, and if it wasn't for the revolution, he would never become more than a peasant soldier, because you couldn't become an officer if you were a peasant born. But because of the revolution, Bernadotte would later, and I'm sorry we don't have much time to discuss him, and he's an episode in itself again, but he was able to climb the ranks to a general because of the revolution.
Absolutely. You've got a lot of stories of people going from inverted commas nothing to hugely significant positions in French society. I mean, you look at somebody like Murat, he's destined to be a cleric, if I remember rightly. I mean, there's a hilarious concept in itself. Murat, part of the clergy, really? I'm not sure they really do kind of like a line in ostrich feathers in clerical garb, but, never mind. So you've got a lot of people who are doing this because the revolution creates opportunity. And one of the things that Napoleon does is he continues that notion that dedicated service and competence will result in reward. It's one of the one of the great positives of his career. But in terms of the Napoleonic Game of Thrones, as I sometimes call it, Bernadotte's the winner. Because if you look at the Bernadotte dynasty, to this day, it sits on the throne of Sweden, whereas Napoleon's dynasty, of course, crumbles come 1815.
So let's talk about his time in the military academy, because he was quite a good mathematician, which you had to be if you wanted to become an officer. And I still believe you do have to be a good mathematician if you want to become an officer to this day. But he was quite really a good mathematician, and he did. So I want to talk a little bit about his career or not career, but in the beginning in the military academy and the training to becoming an officer.
Yeah, I mean, he dedicates himself to his studies. He's a nerd fundamentally. Something that a lot of your listeners hopefully can kind of identify with and respect. He's somebody who throws himself into his studies. There are two ways of thinking about that. One is that he realizes his situation, and he knows that if he's going to get anywhere in life, he's going to have to work a hell of a lot harder than these entitled sons of counts who are his classmates and his contemporaries, because of patronage systems. It's what it's far less the case of what rather than who and he knows that. So that's one reason why we can speculate as to why he dedicates himself so much. Another is he was unpopular for the variety of reasons that we've talked about already. He faced a lot of bigotry and snobbishness. And so if you find yourself ostracized from the inverted commas social groups, what are you going to do with your time? Well, for a lot of folks, and there'll be a lot of listeners, I'd imagine, who found themselves in similar positions, what you do is you dedicate yourself to your studies. Sometimes you find your niche. And he absolutely found that. He was somebody who, you mentioned mathematics, it was pretty obvious that he should have gone into the artillery, so he did in the fullness of time. And what's also quite interesting is what he's reading during this period. So he spends a lot of time reading about people like Caesar and Alexander the Great, writing about them as well, and starting to kind of formulate this idea of, inverted commas, great men of history, and looking at ways in which they can be emulated. So when you put that alongside the Corsican independence thing, there's a curious kind of disconnect in that he's got this strand where he's thinking about people who go and forge great empires, and yet he's also focused on a comparatively small island in the Mediterranean and just kind of making that island independent. So it's very easy to then sort of draw a direct line from, Napoleon's reading about Caesar, Napoleon's reading about Alexander the Great, he's inspired by them. Sure, he is inspired by them, but that doesn't therefore mean that you can draw that direct line in terms of his life arc. And I suspect actually Ridley Scott will draw that direct line if indeed he bothers to
there is
talk
a
about
line
Napoleon's
about
early
the
life.
work in the footstep of Napoleon and Alexander in the latest trailer, I think.
Yeah, again, it sort of taps into this idea. It's a very easy line to talk about, right? There are, and this is a line that the ultra pro-Napoleon crowd like to push quite a lot. There are certain people whose names you instantly know who you're talking about. It's Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. We don't say Wellington and immediately everybody knows who you're talking about. You don't suddenly mistake Alexander for Tsar Alexander, for example, do you? You instantly think Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
And in terms of military conquest, there's no question Napoleon was hugely successful. So it's very easy to kind of tap into those arguments and go, look, this is one of the great men, inverted commas, of history. Let's stick him up on a pedestal. But the challenge, of course, is that once you've done that, you've stripped yourself of objectivity, because you're going to go, here's somebody to worship. Let's look at all of the good things this guy does, which is fine. There's plenty of good stuff to talk about when it comes to Napoleon's skills and attributes and his life. But equally, there's a lot of stuff that he does, that he says, that he inflicts on people that it isn't okay. And it's that challenge of trying to cover both bases at the same time.
I want to, and again, there's a lot we don't have time to discuss here, unfortunately, but I want to begin with the Italian campaign, which is one of the kind of where he gets his name, I would think.
Oh, you want to skip Toulon, do you?
Sorry, but I don't know how much time you have, but I do want.
Should we do like 2 lines on Toulon? So
we can do a little recap in between, if you don't mind. So a little recap of leading up to the Italian campaign, of course.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to get through before you get to the Italian campaign. That's why I kind of think we should perhaps just dwell very briefly on how he gets to the Italian campaign, because by the time he's doing the Italian campaign, we're talking 1796, and he's a full general. So the ultra potted version is 1789. The French Revolution happens, and everything changes for everybody. Completely new. It becomes increasingly radical.
I'm sorry. I was keeping a little mixing in my head a little bit.
Don't worry, mate. Don't worry. You've got to manage a podcast. Normally, I have to do your job, and it's the hard job that most people don't recognize. Now I'm on the other end of the mic, so I can kind of relax a little bit in a different kind of way. 1789, you get a sea change with time. There's a lot of, the revolution becomes increasingly radical, but by the end of it, by the end of the first phase of it, the king has been executed, and you've got a different approach to how people can get on in society. And that this is an ultra simplification, but that process is basically, if you show competence, if you show dedication, if you show commitment to the cause, you will get on in French society, rather than the previous system, which is, are you from, inverted commas, good stock? And by good stock, they're talking about, are you rich? Are you well connected? Are you somebody who is one of the haves in society? Now that gives Napoleon opportunities to prove himself, because people are looking for people who are dedicated, people who are competent, people who can command. And Napoleon can do those things in spades. And he proves that when he's sent to Toulon. He's still relatively junior when he's sent to Toulon, which has risen up against French control, because the revolution basically sort of descends into a civil war in its own right within France. And he's given command of the artillery. He basically has to reorganize the artillery, because it's an absolute pig's ear. The British have sailed in to, and this is going to be depicted incorrectly, I think, within the context of the film, but the British have sailed in when the town rises up. They are very pleased at the prospect of being able to take a huge chunk of the French Mediterranean fleet, which is why Toulon is so important. And they're occupying this place and doing a bit of a bad job of kind of planning for contingencies, because they haven't thought about the possibility that the French might succeed in this siege of Toulon. And then what the hell are you going to do with all of these ships that you're sitting here rubbing your hands about the fact that you've acquired them? So Napoleon very quickly identifies a weak spot in the defenses, realizes that if you can take that particular redoubt, then what you're able to do is dominate the harbor. He personally leads the assault, having reorganized the artillery, and everybody's kind of stunned at the way in which he's able to source these guns and organize them and make it all happen. He demonstrates incredible energy doing that, takes this redoubt, and then that enables the French to then dominate the harbour. Now, in the film, you're going to see a scene, I imagine, where instantly all of the guns from Toulon's defences, wherever they might be, are turned on the British, and you'll get some kind of big artillery barrage, and then the British will run away. Not really how it happened, but by taking that redoubt, what it meant was that it was suicide to leave those ships where they were in the harbour, and so the British had to kind of pull back, and that's how the defences start to waver and crumble. Off the back of all of that, Napoleon is able to ingratiate himself. He's writing letters to significant people within French society, and the government, kind of saying, some of my commanders are incompetent. I've got this plan of action, and by talking to the right people, he's able to get his plan of action implemented. And then when he's proven correct, inevitably he's raised. So he gets promoted to general of brigade, and he's placed in charge of the artillery of France's army of Italy. But then things go a little bit sour, because in 1794, Robespierre falls from grace. So you've got this change of government. Now, Napoleon had managed to associate with some of the Robespierre supporters. So he's arrested on suspicion of being somebody who's in favor of Robespierre. He's eventually released about 3 weeks, less than that, about 2 weeks later. But it does leave him quite jaded about politics. And I often describe Napoleon as being a political chameleon, because my sense is that he shifts with the wind. Whichever way he feels is most likely to suit his own needs, that's his ideology, that's what he's prepared to go with.
I want to ask as well, we spoke about this, that real privileged nobility that Napoleon kind of had to work harder and way harder. How did that change when did it, like we talked about with Bernadotte, he saw a chance and became a general, and of course later the king of Sweden. But how did it really change for the nobility who were generals or had this privileged position after the revolution? And did Napoleon kind of replace how they saw a chance in this, and how did this affect his career with the real privileged nobility after the revolution?
I don't think the fact that Napoleon comes from minor nobility ever hurts him particularly, because he's shown commitment to the cause, right? Toulon is a very clear indication. This is a guy who believes in France, who is prepared to work and fight hard for the advancement of the French cause and for the cause of the revolution. So the challenge for a lot of the aristocracy during the revolution is questions of loyalty. And can you be confident that this individual is utterly committed to the revolution and won't lead a counter-revolution? Now, when Robespierre falls, there's that fear that Napoleon might actually be part of a sort of counter-insurgency, if you like, in favor of Robespierre's style of government. And that's why he's initially arrested, but he's got other friends in other places, and he's able to convince people that actually that's not who he is. He's also given the option of command in the excuse me, in sorry about that, folks. The legacies of an illness that my students managed to cough on me in the first week of the university term. So he's given command of an army in the Vendée, basically told to quell this uprising. He isn't happy about that, because he sees it as beneath him and beneath his talents. He's basically being tasked with crowd control, a civil war, and he doesn't see it as being conducive to him gaining glory. So he basically goes, no, I'm not taking that. Now, turning down a
I don't think I will.
Exactly. Turning down a posting from the French government tends not to do your career prospects much good. And he spends a few months sort of down and out. He's basically unemployed. He, at this point, contemplates suicide, such is the scale of his depression. He thinks he's blown it. And these are the sorts of moments when those lines about, I'm destined for greatness, but my superiors only see me as a tool, start to have some credence, but they're only one part of the story.
Mm.
Napoleon's big break comes with the fact that he saves the Directory. So there's this famous, it's another myth, we're going to see it in the film, this whiff of grape shot scene where it is claimed that Napoleon is integral to the defense of the government by organizing the artillery and firing on a crowd of protesters, predominantly women and children. There are a lot of things that you've heard there that are not actually correct. So the reality is that, yes, he is key in organizing some of the defenses for the government around the government buildings. Murat is the guy who goes and acquires the artillery. And there's this scene where they're literally riding hell for leather through the streets of Paris with these guns in tow, almost running people down, trying to get the guns to where they need to be on time. They do fire on the crowd, but the crowd predominantly consists of armed rebels. There are some women and children within the crowd, but not half as many as you're actually going to see in the film. And this is what I find really interesting, and what I thought was quite encouraging about the trailers, was that you were seeing the myth being played out in such a way that you were having to think about how complex Napoleon is. You know, here's a guy who guns down women and children in the street when they're protesting against the government.
Is this
How
where
do
you
you feel
think that,
about that?
again, to the posters that you see, that it is more kind of a tyrant? Is this where kind of you think that this is the tyranny of Napoleon that Ridley Scott thinks that is plays in?
Yeah, I mean, there are much better historical examples of Napoleonic tyranny, not least what he does to the newspapers and the scale of the censorship and the cooking of the books when it comes to some of his plebiscites. Again, we'll get to those another time, I'm sure. But in terms of a visual depiction, that's going to be your best one, right? It's the most obvious point at which you can make people stop and go, oh, so he's not all cuddly, which I think is what's going to kind of surprise people a little bit. Now, the downside to that is that this is one of those moments where Napoleon's probably been poorly served by the history, because actually the situation was rather different. But in terms
And of
of
course, British propaganda as well, I imagine.
British propaganda, but also really interestingly, Napoleon's own propaganda, he spins this in such a way to make his role in the saving of the government seem bigger. So this whiff of grape shot comment is coined a little bit later, but that firing on the crowd is something that he's able to use, not least because he's demonstrated his loyalty and he gets rewarded for it. And what does he get rewarded with? He gets rewarded with a posting to the French army in Italy.
And that leads us to, of course, the Italian campaign. But I wanted that gives his name, and I want to talk a little bit about crossing the Alps for a second, because it was, I don't believe it was much different. Maybe the roads were a little better, but I
Crossing
don't
the Alps
believe it
is
was
later,
that.
mate.
Yeah. So
So Napoleon conducts a few
yeah,
campaigns in northern
yeah,
Italy. So the crossing of the Alps is in the run up to Marengo. So when
yeah.
he crosses the St. Bernard Pass for the second Italian campaign, the first Italian campaign, he's basically parachuted in to an army that's on its last legs.
Mm.
They're low on supplies. The troops are in rags. Some of them haven't even got shoes. And he somehow got to take this army on the offensive in northern Italy, where he's fighting Piedmont and Austria. And over the course of a year, Napoleon wins something like 18 battles, takes over 100,000 prisoners, 170 standards. Within weeks, he forces Piedmont to sue for peace. He also forces the Austrians to their knees. They cannot find a way to deal with him. Now, some of those battles are very seat of the pants, and you see this through a lot of Napoleon's career, actually. There are a lot of moments, and this is part of why his story is so exciting and kind of has that seductive air to it, because if you're looking for excitement in terms of a guy's story, look no further. You know, the number of times in which these events are sort of hanging on a knife edge is incredible. But he is able to use his army with remarkable efficiency to strike, pivot, outflank, strike again. He's constantly keeping the Austrians guessing, and that's how he gets this nickname, the Italian whirlwind, through that ability to keep hammering them. And eventually they're forced to sue for peace, and this is part of the success for the French in the War of the First Coalition. It's not the only reason for French success, and this is the danger that from this point on, a lot of people start to tell the story of France and the French Revolution solely through the eyes of Napoleon. Napoleon is just one general on what is regarded as the least important front, and probably the least likely to generate success. But actually, what he's able to do is create a new republic, a new state within northern Italy, which he sort of does with a little bit of backing, but it's retrospective backing from the French government, because he effectively starts deciding French government policy by establishing this republic. And the government kind of has to look at it and go, well, we could chastise him for it, but he's winning all of these victories. He's ridiculously good at propaganda, because Napoleon is able to sell this image of victorious general back home for his own benefit. So, if we start criticizing him and start chastising him for what he's doing, that looks bad when it comes to popular opinion. So I think we'll just rubber stamp these things that he's sending
He's
our
kind
way.
of doing what Caesar did in Gaul, isn't he? To compare, he's kind of really good with writing. Maybe not the Gallic Wars, but in Italy. But still, he's kind of doing what Caesar is doing. He's protecting himself in this image, so he can't be a scapegoat in a sense.
Napoleon is an absolute genius with propaganda, whether it's inspiring his men, whether it's whether it's inspiring his men, whether it's trying to get the public on side. Napoleon knows how to spin better than almost anybody. The truth is a nebulous concept that he can play fast and loose with for his own ends, and he does it ridiculously well. He knows how to motivate people. He knows how to get inside their heads. He knows that victories are popular. He knows that rousing speeches will get people fired up, and he knows what to say and when. And he uses it to his full advantage throughout his rise and after.
I want to bring this up. I don't remember exactly when this was, but there was talk about Napoleon going to Turkey and train Turkish troops. And I want to know if he would have done this, would history have been any different, or would it come back and still have conquered half of Europe, or would you think history would have been any different?
This is a really good question. I'm now trying to remember precisely at what point this idea is put forward, because if it's it's around the time that he's talking about going out to Egypt, then you can very easily kind of say, okay, well, you just replace Egypt with this sort of adventure out to Turkey where he starts training Turkish troops. But I'm not sure that it is. I've got a feeling it's one of the options he's considering when he's in Paris, basically without a job. And I'm pretty sure, somebody will probably correct me on the dates, but I'm pretty sure it's from that point. Now, if it is, then it's pre-Italian campaign. The Italian campaign is what properly makes Napoleon's name. So Napoleon doesn't get that opportunity to sell himself. So, let's say he becomes a leading knight in the Ottoman army. Where's he going to go with that? Go to war with Russia? I mean, great, but you'd be talking about a need for a root and branch reform of the Ottoman forces. All we can do is speculate. Obviously, history ends up being very different, but what you would get is still the Brumaire coup. So you would still get somebody toppling the French government in 1799. It's just a question of who that somebody might be.
But let's talk about Egypt and after the Italian campaign, because Egypt is a fascinating piece. And of course, we have to bring this up. It's because of the Napoleon in Egypt that we have the infamous Rosetta Stone. That, of course, because of course it is in the British Museum right now. but
Yeah, but that's
it's
because British
still
love to
because
take
of
shiny things and stick them in our
yeah,
museum, and then when people go, "Look, this is ours. Can we have it back?" We sort of go,
yeah.
"That's
No, I
that's
don't
that's
think
a
so.
challenge right now. You can come and have a look. We've got it on display. Would you like to
Yeah,
look? We can give you a quick look at it if you like,
yeah.
but send it back to you. No,
I don't
we've
think
looked
I
after it for
will.
a long time, so we're going to hold on to it.
Yeah. And then, of course, I feel like it's worth mentioning that the Rosetta Stone was found because of the Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. Just a little fun fact to add. But
Yes,
let's talk
indeed.
about Egypt is such a fascinating. Of course, we'll see this in the movie. That and as historians have pointed out, it did not take place. The Battle of the Pyramids did not take place in at the pyramid, but 6 kilometers or so away from the pyramid. But still called the Battle of the Pyramids.
Yeah.
And again, Egypt is such a fascinating part of Napoleon's life. We spoke about this in over a year ago now with the Eugene Rodin. I think genuinely after the and I'm sorry for rambling, but he did genuinely try to improve Egypt as well when he was there. He did genuinely try to do good in Egypt. But let's talk. I'm getting ahead of myself, but still, let's talk about Napoleon in Egypt.
Napoleon's Egyptian adventure is, in some parts, scientific expedition. In some parts, it's an absolutely crazy plan. So the concept behind this is partly, hey, France needs more colonies, and it's partly about how do we really hammer the British. And there is this sort of bizarre plan at the heart of it all that Egypt is going to be used as a base to then strike at British India. Now, the first thing you have to do is look at a map. Um, and when you do, you realize that sure, Egypt is part of the way, but you've got a heck of a long way to go if you're using Egypt as a base. Not least because the French have got no way realistically of shipping an army from Egypt to India, so you have
Mm.
to go by the overland route, and this is where you can argue Napoleon goes kind of full Alexander the Great in terms of his vision, because the concept is you take Egypt, you use it as a base, and then you march on India,
Mm.
carrying the local population with you as you attempt to, and then descending into northern India, uniting the different principalities against the British and forcing them out, causing catastrophic damage to British trade and the prestige of the empire. It's a nice idea, but when you look at the practicalities, it's absolutely potty. There was no way realistically that it was going to
Mm.
work, because you're talking about going through places like Afghanistan, known as the graveyard of empires, or would
Mm.
go on to be known as the graveyard of empires. You're talking going through Iran, then Persia. These
Mm.
are places that do not take kindly to foreign armies just sort of casually marching in,
There's a
violating their
reason it's called the
neutrality.
graveyard of empires. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an insane plan. I mean, marks out of 10 for ambition, sure. But in terms of realism, it was never going to work out. It
We
just
should
wasn't.
We should bring up as well that one of the reasons Napoleon wanted Egypt was, of course, the Suez Canal, I believe, and which was the way to India, which would weaken the believed would if it got the Suez Canal, which was quite new at the time, he would have weakened the British Empire. So if he was able to get to India, the British Empire would, of course, be weakened as well.
So with Suez, it's a French idea.
Mm.
And it's an idea that's born out of the
Mm.
occupation of Egypt, so post conquest.
Right.
Um, and it doesn't become a reality for decades to come. In terms of the
Mm.
logistics, it's a huge engineering task
It has been
to make
tried
happen.
before, we should add as well,
It
but
had indeed, but at that point in time, it's something that the French start to very seriously look at once they've managed to gain control. In terms of that process of gaining control, it's not particularly complex. With the best will in the world, the Mamluk army isn't a match for
no.
a very well disciplined French force. But of course, Napoleon ends up being marooned out in excuse me, out in Egypt, courtesy of a certain Horatio Nelson, the British admiral, who attacks the French Med fleet, or the troops that are, sorry, the ships that are supporting Napoleon's convoy from the French Mediterranean fleet, at the Battle of Aboukir Bay, better known as the Battle of the Nile. And that completely annihilates Napoleon's naval support, catastrophically damages the French fleet in the Med, takes out a significant portion of it, and it basically leaves Napoleon marooned out there. He can't get supplies in because the French now haven't got the ships to protect a supply convoy and a reinforcement convoy. So he knows he is out there with a dwindling force. He sort of tries to begin fighting his way out, partly because, unsurprisingly, the Ottomans aren't hugely pleased that their vassal state has just been summarily toppled by the French. So he launches this sort of preemptive strike, knowing that war is coming, up into what we would today call the Holy Land. That doesn't go particularly well, beset by plague. There's a very nasty incident where a bunch of prisoners are executed, and if you're in favor of Napoleon, you will turn around and argue, well, these prisoners had given their word that they'd previously been prisoners, they'd been released, and they'd given their word as part of that release that they wouldn't fight the French anymore. Also, the French were struggling to supply themselves with food, so what the hell was he meant to do with these prisoners? That's certainly Napoleon's line. He has this sort of angry outburst, what am I meant to do with these men? Why have you brought them to me? But equally, when somebody surrenders and then you have them executed, 2,000 of them, it is not a good look. So again, it's one of those moments. We're probably not going to see this in the film. I'll be surprised. But it's one of those moments where Napoleon doesn't come out smelling roses from this. It's another one of those moments where it's a Machiavellian decision, and sometimes Machiavellian decisions are troubling. That attempt to gain a foothold in the Near East doesn't work. He's eventually forced back. He isn't able to successfully kind of anchor himself. He's short of supplies, short of men. So he has to cut and run back to Egypt. And it's at that point that he has to start seriously thinking about his future, and start considering, are his interests best served out in Egypt? Or, considering the unrest that's happening back in France, is it more beneficial for him to go back to France as this sort of conquering hero? Because he's still been cultivating that image. He's able to send some of these artifacts back to Paris. He's able to send back reports on what he has been doing. He has set himself up as kind of this vassal. He's demonstrated the ability of leadership out in this new French colony. He's quelled unrest. He's demonstrated he can be a strong man. He's obviously got battlefield success. Can he use that to capitalize and therefore take control of the French government? And so he does exactly that. He literally abandons his army.
No,
he does say,
I'm sorry for interrupting you again,
go for it.
But I want to wind back a little bit before the Napoleon Egyptian campaign, because there was someone I want to introduce that I rather forgot about introducing, and that is a lady that we've seen also, and that's rather known as Josephine. And I have mixed feelings about her, because she was what we call an opportunist, or what I like to call today a gold digger. Am I right in calling her that? Because she is rather an interesting figure and let's talk about how she is introduced to Napoleon and their relationship, of course, how and when he goes into the Italian campaign. It's already the Egyptian campaign, but we are going to go back to his return, but I want to, of course, talk about their relationship, which of course is essential in the movie as well.
It is. The slightly troubling thing about the way in which this movie has been advertised is that they seem to be making out that everything Napoleon ever did was purely to please Josephine. So you name it, it's because of Josephine and because of Napoleon trying to win Josephine's affection, which frankly does a disservice to Napoleon, his drive, his ability, and his vision, because Napoleon was very much his own man. Yes, there was definitely friction and tension, especially early on in his relationship with Josephine. there is absolutely no question that Napoleon was way more into Josephine than Josephine was into Napoleon for much of the early part of their marriage. But there are reasons for that. Was Josephine a gold digger? I feel for Josephine. I think she's placed in a very difficult situation. And it's easy to look at.
She was an opportunist, definitely.
She was certainly an opportunist, but that's a situation that I think to a large degree is forced upon her. Her husband gets executed during the French Revolution. He gets guillotined, which therefore means that she's in this incredibly dangerous situation with children where she needs to find a way to survive, because if she's not careful, she's going to be in the street as a beggar. And how does she support her kids? How does she survive day to day? She's facing an incredibly bleak future. She ends up becoming the mistress of Barras, which ultimately is how Josephine and Napoleon meet. And part of that relationship is that Barras supports Josephine financially. That therefore enables her to enjoy the finer things in life. It also enables her to support her family. And Josephine does like the finer things in life. Make no mistake about that. But then Barras decides to take up a new mistress, which basically means he casts Josephine aside. She's basically rubbish. His attitude is, I've finished with you. I am no longer going to support you financially. But I have good news for you. There's this young up-and-coming guy. He's called Napoleon. Great guy. You go and marry him. He'll be able to support you financially, and then it'll all be fine. So Josephine basically gets used as almost like a reward, like a bauble that gets dangled in front of Napoleon. You know, well done for, because this happens in around the time of the Whiff of Grape shot thing. Well done, Napoleon. Here's your reward. Here's a lady that you can go and marry. Now, Napoleon is absolutely smitten with Josephine. If you read,
we should mention her teeth as well. They're not very appealing. She was appealing in look, and I'm not sure about personality, but her teeth pretty much described as being the biggest appalling thing about her.
Yeah, this is a thing that gets mentioned a lot. Sure, her teeth were in a bad state, but it didn't seem to put Napoleon off. Certainly when you look at those love letters, he was they're agonizing. I find them agonizing to read, because it is so obvious that he has fallen head over heels in an almost kind of teenage way. There's a sort of an almost naive vulnerability about Napoleon in the way in which he writes to Josephine, which in one sense you can go, well, look, this is awfully sweet. And in another sense, you kind of look at it and go, the guy is needy as hell. Part of the reason that he will have become so needy is because it will have been painfully obvious to him that Josephine was not returning his affections. It said that his love letters went unopened. Josephine had multiple lovers pre-marriage, and she continued most notably
let's not
with
pretend like Napoleon
Charles.
did not have affairs as well outside
Absolutely.
their marriage.
This is the thing, that they both give as good as they get. Napoleon later, but by the time he's going on the Egypt expedition, he is chasing other officers' wives and having affairs, and is being quite brazen about it. We are going to see a lot of Hippolyte Charles, I think, in the film, kind of cast as one of the two main, inverted commas, bad guys of the whole thing, you know, because this is being overplayed to the point where the guy's actually seen in the coronation scene, which is just odd because it wasn't an issue by that point. But it's a very convenient hook to tag everything on for storytelling purposes, because again, the film is about entertainment. So you are going to see a lot of him in the film, flirting outrageously with Vanessa Kirby's Josephine. Sure, they did carry on for much of the time that Napoleon was on the first Italian campaign. But as you say, you know, Napoleon has multiple mistresses over the course of his life, Marie Walewska being most obvious one. And the reason the marriage breaks down is, excuse me, in part because Josephine can't have kids by this point.
Mm.
And initially Napoleon thinks it might be
I'm sure we will come back to
him.
this in part 2.
Oh yeah,
of
we will
course.
do.
Yeah.
Initially he thinks that it's him, and then he has an illegitimate child, and then off the back of that he knows that actually no, he can father kids. And so in terms of dynasty building, post becoming emperor, that becomes a really key part. But there is love there when they have their divorce ceremony. There are these really heartfelt statements that they both make on behalf of one another. Napoleon loves Josephine all the way through his life. It's believed, there's a lot of debate about this, but it's believed that one of the last things he says is Josephine's name. But yeah, Josephine, she loved to spend money. There's one point where she is buying pretty much the equivalent of one hat per day. Now you go, well, it's a hat, but you know, this is the 19th century. She's married to the leader of the French government by this point. These are going to be nice hats, and with the best will in the world, how many hats does one person honestly need in their life? So sure, she loves to spend money. It gets very awkward. Napoleon has to have a conversation with the debtors because she's run up such vast debts, and he basically says, look, I'll pay half and you'll keep quiet about this. And they agree because it's the only way they're going to get any money out of the whole thing. And it does irritate him. Sure, she's not, you know, careful with her finances, put it that way. But I think there's a lot of demonization of Josephine. There's this sort of assumption that she should have been as devoted to Napoleon as Napoleon was to her. And it's just a sad reality of life. This was a marriage of convenience. It was an arranged marriage. And is it really that surprising that under the circumstances she wasn't that keen?
Yeah.
And I think because she's a woman, we love to point the finger a lot more at her affairs, and then sort of in the process do what the opposite of what we've done in this, which is kind of, you know, we've kind of turned around and said, well, look, they're both at it. And I think quite often that gets pushed to the side, you know, that kind of not tonight Josephine mentality, as if she's kind of this crazed nymphomaniac. The age difference is also often made out to be a big thing because there's about 5 years between them, which is bizarre.
I mean, that's normal. 5 years is not uncommon. Even today.
By modern standards, it's nothing. And by the standards of the day, if you were a man, it wouldn't be unusual for you to be in your 30s or 40s marrying somebody who was just coming out of their teens. So again, there's this kind of double standard of morality that's being thrown at Josephine just because she's a woman.
And there was someone that we don't have to talk equally long about her, but there was another woman in his life that would later again marry Bernadotte and do rather well as the Queen of Sweden, which is Desiree, who rather was she was actually quite fond of Napoleon, and I do believe that he broke her heart as well. But why did not Desiree and Napoleon happen?
Napoleon treats Desiree pretty awfully, actually. He regards her as something of an improvement project. He doesn't feel that she's reading the right things, so he instructs her on what she should be reading and how she should be dressing. Napoleon can be, I mean, not particularly surprising for a dictator, he can be quite controlling. Josephine didn't actually prefer to go by the name Josephine. She preferred to go by the name Rose, but Napoleon comes along and changes that. No, you're going to be Josephine. There's a lot of speculation about whether or not that Josephine fixation is actually a fixation with Napoleon's brother, Joseph, and whether there's sort of a brother thing, a brother complex kind of going on there. You can speculate with that for as long as you like. She has a horrible life, actually. She doesn't want to go with Bernadotte when he becomes King of Sweden. She hates the life out there. She wants to go back to France. They separate. She's one of the really tragic stories of the Napoleonic period amongst the hierarchy. Obviously, there are plenty of, you know, individual personal tragedies for people who lose loved ones over the course of these wars, but her story is pretty awful. You know, she basically gets kind of pushed in the direction of Bernadotte. There you go. I don't want this woman anymore. You know, Bernadotte, you have her. Yeah, it's a really sad story, but Napoleon feels that he can do better, and of course Josephine comes along, and as we've said, he is absolutely smitten.
So let's talk about his return and he taking power. And I wanted to say that, of course, I felt wanted to derail a little bit because I felt that the woman in Napoleon's life was important as well to talk about. And when it comes to coronation, I wanted as well to talk about his family because, in my view, they are kind of like real life Dickens character, aren't they? The family of Napoleon. And I want to talk about them and how they want to profit from everything as well when he takes power because it's really kind of that they are want to do as little as possible and enjoy life as well when he takes power and have benefit as much as they can from it.
One of Napoleon's is there a profanity filter on this podcast? I should
I don't think
probably.
that. Go ahead,
Okay,
be my
so
guest.
I'll be gentle with our listeners, just in case there are any younger viewers or listeners tuning in. But some of his family are absolute arseholes, and his sister in particular is an absolute bitch, a grade A bitch. The one who marries Murat, and her name
Like
is
I
just
said, they
dropped.
are Dickens characters. Like you think you would read
Yeah,
Dickens.
yeah. Um, yeah, just awful. Caroline Bonaparte. Oh my god. Um, awful. Absolutely awful. Yes, so Napoleon's rise to power. So you've got two phases of this. The first is, and I think this complexity will be ignored in the film, but you've got the coup, the Brumaire coup in 1799, and then you've got Napoleon being crowned emperor in December 1804.
And
So quite
actually, I want to,
obviously,
I'm sorry for interrupting you again, but there's a little fun fact I want to add to this, and I'm sure you know this, but there was a Colombian guy that was in Paris at the time, and he was a big fan of Napoleon up until he was crowned emperor, but he lost respect for him at the time. And I'm sure you know who I'm talking about because that guy was later Simon Bolivar, who would of course conquer South America. And I feel like they have kind of a parallel story that kind of the same Bolivar and Napoleon, which is both rise to greatness and they both kind of end the same way. So I feel like there is a lot of parallel. It's just a little fun fact I wanted to add, but again, feel like there is a parallel with Bolivar and Napoleon.
I mean, Napoleon's probably more successful. Bolivar's
Yeah.
life is fascinating. The political situation out in South America is so complex,
Hmm.
and the amount of kind of false starts and sort of the rise and fall and then rise again and then fall again. It's incredible. It's probably a on a personal level, it's probably a more dramatic epic than even
Hmm.
Napoleon's life.
Yeah. But they do have kind of parallels, in a sense, just different continents on different scale.
So there's a lot of there are a lot of attempts to sort of create Napoleons of other
Yeah.
places,
Yeah.
and you could make an argument that perhaps Bolivar is the Napoleon of South America. But yeah, there are parallels. You can draw parallels with quite a few people across this
Hmm.
time period, can't you? But yes, he so Napoleon actually irritates quite and disillusions quite a lot of people when he becomes emperor. Another very famous one is Ludwig van Beethoven, who
Yeah. He wrote a
take
sonnet for him, didn't he? And then he tore it apart when he
he
crowned
wrote
himself emperor.
a symphony. I believe it's
So,
Eroica.
yeah.
Was actually that I would need to double check that. I've got in my head it's simply number three, but then I had a conversation
Yeah,
with
I'm
a
sure
music
that's not that
historian
important.
who kind of made me question that. But yes, he wrote a piece of music, dedicated it to Napoleon. Then when he heard the news that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, just took his pen and scratched out Napoleon's name in absolute disgust, because it was seen as a betrayal of the principles of the revolution. But let's rewind a little bit. So 1799, the Brumaire coup, it nearly goes
Yeah.
catastrophically wrong and very nearly ends up with Napoleon dead. He is physically assaulted. So there are two chambers that he has to address, and so the Council of the Ancients and the 500. And what he does initially, he plays this very carefully, and it's a group um, a group planned thing. It's not just Napoleon, and that gets missed. Everybody talks about it being Napoleon's coup. Actually, they consider multiple possibilities as the nominal leader of this coup. Napoleon is the one who comes out on top. And the plan is that they force the government to move to the outskirts of Paris, where they're away from the Parisian mob, which therefore means they don't have the support of the mob, which therefore means they're easier to control. You then surround it with troops that are loyal to Napoleon. Murat, funnily enough, is out there in the midst of all of this. And Napoleon, basically, having got these guys out there with the sort of false claim of a Jacobin conspiracy, turns around to them and effectively tells them it's over. He tells the ancients, and they aren't convinced, and they tell him to get lost. He then tries with the Council of the 500 and gets assaulted, narrowly escapes. And the only reason that this whole thing is successful is thanks to his brother Lucien, who very dramatically draws his ceremonial dagger and says, if my brother is a traitor, then I will kill him myself. And that sort of calms everybody down a little bit. And then the message is sent out to bring in the troops quick. This is going horribly wrong. We need to get these guys out. And they basically forcibly clear the chambers. Napoleon bungles his initial speech. He had actually had a riding accident a few days before. And so historian Ed Coss has raised the possibility that part of the reason why he bungles this so badly might have been that he was still recovering from the resulting brain injury. He'd been unconscious for a heck of a long time. But in any case, one of the members of the government shouts, "But what about the revolution?" And Napoleon basically says, "Look, the revolution's over. You betrayed that revolution multiple times. Get out." And so what they installed is something called the consul system. There are meant to be 3 consuls that rotate. Funnily enough, that rotation never actually happens. And you get, in 1801, a plebiscite that confirms, well, there's a plebiscite actually for the Brumaire coup. There's also one, excuse me, for the declaration of first consul for life. And then there's another one for the conversion of consul for life to emperor. Now, we talked earlier about sort of inverted commas election rigging. This is an odd one because there was plenty enough support amongst the French population for each of these moves. And that's an important point to emphasize. And yet the books still get cooked. So in departments, people are adding zeros on the ends of returns in favor just because they can, literally inflating them by a proportion of 10. You also get people kind of going, okay, look, there are 30 votes against. We're going to reduce that down to 4 for no obvious reason. The entirety of the army, and bear in mind that France has a large standing army at this point in time, the entirety of the army is assumed to have voted in favor. People who vote against are, inverted commas, encouraged to change their minds. You've also got a public voting system where you can add additional peer pressure onto it. So it's not sort of the great example of democracy that people sometimes like to make out. He would have got all of these measures comfortably over the line without the corruption, but nonetheless, it does show that Napoleon has a vision for a right answer. And if you're not prepared to go along with that right answer, then there are consequences. And if I don't get the right answer, then I'll just make it up until I do get the answer that I want. It is a dictatorship, and it's important to remember that.
So let's talk about recognition. How many countries after Napoleon's crown actually recognized Napoleon as an emperor? Because it's important to get, of course, with a new regime, you need the recognition as well from other empires or other countries. So how many people recognize Napoleon and a new regime in France?
Well, this is the unending debate. And Michael Brewers talks about this and kind of questions whether or not, Michael Brewers being one of the leading historians on Napoleon, questions whether or not there was a willingness to accept the, inverted commas, Bonaparte regime as legitimate. Bear in mind that in 1801, Britain finally agrees to the Peace of Amiens. That then crumbles in 1803, so before the whole coronation situation. But what it means is that there is a willingness to work with the French government with Napoleon at the helm. And that's something that is often contested, because there's a certain irony here, isn't there, that the Bourbons have been toppled by the French government, and then the French government has in time gone through a series of kind of convoluted spirals and somersaults, and then gone back to what is basically a hereditary monarchy. That's all the empire is, just under a different name. Napoleon is king, but with a different title. He's emperor instead. And he is, sure, the inverted commas Corsican upstart. Does that mean that people won't work with him? No. They will absolutely work with him, because what the European nations want, what they crave, what they all need is stability. By 1804, excuse me, by 1804, there's been more than a decade of conflict on the continent. Europe is already exhausted by this conflict.
But wait, there's more coming.
Exactly. You know, you've got a whole day, spoiler alert, you've got 11 more years to come. So I disagree with this idea that because Napoleon wasn't from a long-standing dynasty, that the other nations of Europe weren't willing to work with him. I believe that it's actually the case, based on the reactions that you see and what it is that pushes these other nations into conflict. It's Napoleon's insistence on carving out a France that is so dominant that it destabilizes the balance of power to the point where the other nations simply can't tolerate the humiliation, because you either basically accept Napoleon as the de facto overlord of everything that happens in Europe and forget your own country's interests, or you go to war.
And in the biography, Adam I'm sorry if I say his name wrong, Adam Samoyski, he argues that there were, when we speak about new dynasties, there were the dynasties that at the time they weren't that old. The Habsburgs were quite new. The Hanoverians have only ruled for quite a while in England, and even at the time the Russian Romanovs, they weren't quite that old at that time, so there were quite new dynasties ruling. And of course in Sweden you had the king been thrown out in don't remember when, but still it was quite new dynasties. They weren't that ancient as people like to make it out to believe that at the time.
So one of the oldest dynasties during this period sits on the throne of Spain. The Bourbon dynasty is amongst the oldest that's left at this point. And what's Spain doing for much of this period, all the way up, in fact, to 1808, when Napoleon just decides to stab his ally in the back, reluctant ally though they were, they're allied to France. So, you know, there's a nation that is prepared to work with France. So you can understand, but again, it kind of taps into this image that we're going to see of the film of, you know, poor Napoleon. He's the outcast, he's the upstart, and nobody's willing to work with him, and it's all a conspiracy against Napoleon. This is a line that the ultra pro-Napoleon fans love to push, that Napoleon is the victim in all of this. He's a man of peace. He doesn't want war, which respectively is absolute codswallop, because Napoleon is brilliant at war, so good at it, to the point where he can win a war but not win the peace. And so in those situations where you've got the option of, I can try and pursue a diplomatic solution, or I can go to war, he's going to back himself with war, because he knows he's got the skills to win. And that's part of the challenge, really, with Napoleon, because he's kind of a victim of his own success on the battlefield, because he is so capable on the battlefield that it means that he can dictate any kind of peace terms that he wants to. That therefore means there is less inclination to compromise. He's got his enemies by the balls, quite frankly, when it comes to the points when they are negotiating. And that therefore means that he takes too much. He asks for too much. And then, as we said, that destabilizes the balance of power. And that therefore makes the prospect of war that much more likely. There were points at which he could have established particularly if he'd been less ambitious with the continental system in 1807. There were points at which he could have had his peace in Europe and where his dynasty could have survived. But by pushing for too much, it meant that other nations basically had the choice of take the humiliation or sit on it. That bred resentment that then in turn leads to war, and eventually those wars take their toll.
I think we're going to round it up there, and we're going to take a look next week at the Napoleonic campaign. And the episode, because it's on Wednesday, 22nd November, that the movie will be released, I'm releasing the second part on the day of the premiere, so you can listen to both parts on the day of the premiere and then go and enjoy Napoleon and judge it for yourself. So before we go, do you have anything you want to promote or any social media where people might find you if they have or want to learn more about Napoleon or have any questions that we did not discuss in this episode?
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter. Yes, I still call it Twitter at Zack Whites History. You can also catch my podcast where I talk about this kind of stuff all the time. The Napoleonic Wars podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, you name it. There's my YouTube channel, the Napoleonic Wars channel. Does what it says on the tin, basically. And I'm also the chair of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charity, an organization that I set up in 2021 that tries to honor the memory of the ordinary men and women who died during this conflict by restoring veteran graves, repairing them where necessary, cleaning them, but also making sure that those who were disturbed through archaeological processes or any other, through no fault of their own, those who are disinterred actually get the dignity of a burial in the ground in a marked grave, which is not something that is the norm. Most of the time, these people are kind of either stuck on display or they are stuck in a storage box because nobody really knows quite how to deal with this situation. And so we go in and try and make the case and provide the financial support and logistical support to get these people their place in the earth so that they can, in fact, rest in peace.
And you are working on a book as well, I believe, about the crime during Napoleonic era, I think, if I remember correctly.
Absolutely right. So I did my doctorate at Southampton University. It's a very slow burn, that book. It needs more writing needs to happen. But yes, I am. My specialism was crime and punishment in the British Army during the Napoleonic era, and at some point that will eventually result in a book. If you do want a book that's already done, I edited The Sword and the Spirit, which was a set of conference papers basically that were produced at a conference that I organized in 2019. The first chapter of which actually is on Napoleon's mental states and considers the possibility that he had something called narcissistic personality disorder, which has a lot of implications for how we might interpret some of Napoleon's actions. We can perhaps talk about that a little bit more next time.
Yeah.
But the results for that were staggering. A lot of people sort of sometimes turn around and go, well, this is hugely problematic. They were very careful in how that assessment was done. A team of US Army psychologists worked with a leading historian to assess a huge range of information. They actually went looking for PTSD, not signs of narcissism. And it was just what fell out of the research that led them towards the possibility, and that is worth emphasizing, it is a possibility, but the indicators are there that Napoleon may have had narcissistic personality disorder.
Thank you so much for coming on. I cannot wait to record part 2 and for you to listen to part 2 or the movie itself. I'm really looking forward to this, and it's going to be so much fun. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, I would really appreciate if you wrote a review of our podcast. I will try to read it if I see it on our podcast as well. If you're on Spotify, give us 5 stars. Or if you are on YouTube, please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Adam. Stay tuned for part 2. Also, check out some other episodes we have. I'm fairly sure you will find something that you like. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.